Hello and welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Hey, before we begin our journey into relaxation, if you feel so inclined, please gently tap the like button. It helps us share these moments of calm with more people. And if you'd like to stay updated on future stories and peaceful journeys, consider subscribing to the channel. Also, if you have an idea for a story or a theme you'd like to hear in a future video, please feel free to share it in the comments below. Now, take a slow, deep breath with me. Let your shoulders drop. Feel any tension gently melt away. Release any thoughts or worries from your day. This is your time to simply allow your body to relax, your mind to quiet, and prepare to drift into a peaceful state. Let's begin. We find ourselves, or rather, we shall endeavor to place our mental faculties in a geographical expanse that, for the sake of clarity and consistent referential indexing, we'll refer to as the lower riverine basin of the greater western flux. This designation, while perhaps not immediately evocative of dramatic historical epochs or momentous human undertakings, represents its purpose with a certain undeniable and, frankly, somewhat tedious precision. It is a region, to be precise, a rather unremarkable stretch of land, characterized primarily by its flatness. Yes, a profound and pervasive flatness. This flatness, it must be noted, was not a sudden geological anomaly, but rather the cumulative results of countless millennia of sedimentary deposition, a process that, while entirely natural and expected, also contributed significantly to the region's overall lack of topographical excitement. The sky above this basin, as previously hinted, often presented itself as a canvas of muted, uninspiring gray. Not a tempestuous, dramatic gray, mind you, nor a luminous, ethereal gray, but simply a functional, everyday gray. A gray that merely existed, fulfilling its meteorological obligations without any particular flair or urgency. The sun, when it chose to pierce this pervasive grayness, did so with a certain diffidence, casting a light that was more illuminating than warming, more present than vibrant. It was, one might observe, a light that merely confirmed the existence of objects, rather than imbuing them with any particular visual interest. Our journey, if one can truly call such a slow and deliberate amble a journey, begins not with a bang, nor indeed with a whimper, but with the almost imperceptible rustle of early agricultural practices. For it was in this very basin, this rather flat and consistently gray-skied basin, that human beings, in their slow, methodical, and often uninspired way, began to grapple with the fundamental challenges of sustenance. Their lives, it must be understood, were not characterized by grand narratives or heroic exploits, but by the repetitive, cyclical demands of daily survival. A survival that, for the most part, involved a great deal of bending, digging, and the consistent application of rudimentary tools to recalcitrant soil. Consider, if you will, the very earliest implements used in this agrarian endeavor. They were predictably simple, utterly, unequivocally simple, not complex in design, nor intricate in their functionality. Their primary virtue, if one can assign such a term to such unadorned objects, lay in their availability and their basic capacity to interact with the earth. A sharpened stick, for instance? Yes, a stick, chosen not for its aesthetic appeal or its sophisticated ergonomic properties, but merely for its inherent stickness and its somewhat pointed end. This sharpened stick, or digging stick, as it was rather unimaginatively, but accurately termed, represented a monumental, albeit incredibly slow, step forward from merely scrounging for wild edibles. It allowed for the deliberate insertion of a wooden shaft into the ground, a process that, while laborious, did facilitate the creation of small depressions into which seeds could, with varying degrees of success, be placed. The act of using this digging stick was itself a rather monotonous affair. One would grasp the stick often with both hands, positions that varied slightly from individual to individual, but generally involved a firm grip. Then, with a slow and deliberate motion, the pointed end would be pressed, or sometimes even pushed, into the soil. The resistance of the earth varied, of course, depending on its moisture content, and the presence of any underlying geological irregularities, such as small stones or particularly stubborn clumps of clay. These variations, while scientifically interesting in a purely pedological sense, did not, it must be stressed, contribute to any particular excitement on the part of the individual wielding the stick. It was merely a different texture to overcome, a slightly altered degree of effort to expend. Once a sufficient depression, or divot, or hole. The terminology, while varying slightly, refers to essentially the same outcome. Had been created, the next step involved the careful, or sometimes less careful, placement of a seed. These seeds, often small and unremarkable in appearance, held within them the promise of future sustenance, a promise that, in those early days, was often more a hope than a certainty. The act of placing the seed was a delicate one, requiring a certain degree of manual dexterity, or at least a consistent lack of clumsiness. The seed would be gently dropped, or sometimes deliberately pushed into the newly formed cavity, after which a small amount of soil would be pushed back over it, often with the side of the foot or a hand, or indeed the same digging stick, used for the initial excavation. This final step, the covering of the seed, was crucial for its protection from various environmental depredations, such as the relentless wind or the occasional foraging bird. This process of selecting a stick, sharpening it, pushing it into the ground, inserting a seed, and then covering that seed, was repeated day after day, week after week, across vast stretches of this lower riverine basin. The sheer repetitiveness of it all is difficult for the modern mind to fully grasp, accustomed as we are to ever-changing stimuli and dynamic activities. For these early agriculturalists, however, repetition was not merely a characteristic of their work. It was the very essence of their existence. The rhythms of their lives were dictated by the seasons, by the slow growth of their crops, and by the unending cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting. There was little deviation, little innovation, little that could be described as truly exciting. The tools, as mentioned, remained simple for a considerable period. While the digging stick was undoubtedly a fundamental innovation, its evolution was, to put it mildly, glacial. For many generations, the basic design remained largely unaltered. Slight variations might occur in the type of wood chosen, perhaps a slightly denser wood for better durability, or a lighter wood for easier handling. But the core functionality and the rudimentary form persisted. This lack of rapid development was not due to a deficit of intelligence on the part of these early humans, but rather to the overwhelming demands of their daily lives and the sheer difficulty of conceptualizing and then implementing truly novel designs with their limited resources and understanding of material science. Eventually, however, very, very slowly, over the course of what can only be described as an almost imperceptibly long span of time, a minor refinement began to emerge. This refinement involved not just a stick, but a stick with a small, flat piece of stone or bone attached to its end. This attachment, often secured with rudimentary bindings made from animal sinew or plant fibers, transformed the simple digging stick into something marginally more efficient: a proto-hoe. The flat, broad surface of the stone or bone allowed for a slightly wider displacement of soil with each push, thereby, in theory, reducing the number of individual digs required to prepare a given patch of land. This was, by any measure, a subtle improvement, not a revolutionary leap. The effort required was still substantial, the motions still repetitive, and the overall pace of work remained decidedly unhurried. The development of this proto-hoe was not a sudden invention by a single brilliant individual. Rather, it was likely the result of countless small, almost accidental discoveries, combined with the slow, incremental sharing of ideas across generations. One individual might have noticed that a particularly flat stone, when held against a stick, seemed to move soil more effectively. Another might have experimented with different methods of securing that stone. These minor observations and experiments, carried out by individuals who were likely more concerned with the practicalities of their next meal than with the abstract principles of engineering, gradually accumulated into a slightly more refined tool. The speed of this transmission of knowledge was, of course, exceptionally slow. Limited by the constraints of communication and the geographical isolation of many early communities. Imagine the daily routine: the rising of the sun, slow and uninspired; the walk to the fields, a path well-worn and familiar, devoid of unexpected scenery; the rhythmic thud-scrape of the proto-hoes against the earth; the constant repetitive bending and straightening of backs; occasional brief communal grunts or murmurs, devoid of any particular excitement or urgency; The entire process was one of slow, deliberate, and undeniably tedious effort. There were no dramatic confrontations with wild beasts during this specific activity. No sudden discoveries of hidden treasures beneath the soil. No grand or inspiring vistas to behold. Just the earth, the tool, and the endless, unvarying application of human labor. The soil itself, the very medium with which these early tools interacted, held its own uninteresting characteristics. It was, for the most part, a mixture of silt, clay, and sand, its precise composition varying slightly from one field to another within the basin. These variations, while scientifically catalogable, did not significantly alter the fundamental challenges faced by the agriculturalists. Whether the soil was slightly more clay or slightly sandier, the effort of tilling remained largely the same: a consistent application of force, a persistent push and pull against the earth's resistance. The subtle nuances of soil texture were primarily concerns for the plants themselves, influencing their root development and water absorption. Rather than providing any particularly thrilling interaction for the human cultivators, even the weather, a factor so crucial to agricultural success, often presented itself in an equally monotonous fashion. The rainy season would arrive, bringing with it a steady, unremarkable deluge of precipitation that carved dramatic ravines, nor gentle, misty drizzles that evoked poetic introspection. Simply rain, a persistent, functional rain that adequately watered the crops, and occasionally made the soil slightly muddier and therefore marginally more difficult to traverse. The dry season, in contrast, brought with it a predictable lack of rain, leading to a gradual hardening of the earth, making the task of digging all the more arduous. These seasonal shifts were not dramatic events, but rather the slow, inevitable turning of the environmental calendar, dictating the unchanging rhythms of life in the lower riverine basin. The history of this period, therefore, is not a history of grand empires or famous battles. It is instead a history of sticks, and then slightly more advanced sticks, with stones attached. A history of small depressions in the earth and the careful placement of small seeds. A history of patient waiting and the slow, arduous process of harvesting. It is a history that unfolded at an almost imperceptibly slow pace, a pace that mirrors the very movements of the individuals engaged in these ancient, unexciting tasks. The passage of time itself seemed to stretch and dilate, each year blending into the next with a remarkable lack of distinguishing features. Consider, too, the concept of a day in this historical context. It was not marked by a frenetic pace of activity, nor by a diverse array of tasks. A typical day would begin with the subtle shift from darkness to the muted light of dawn. The preparation of a simple meal, consumed without much ceremony. Then the walk to the fields, a journey that was undertaken not with eagerness, but with a sense of inevitability. The long hours spent in the fields, engaged in the repetitive motions of cultivation, setting of the sun, bringing with it the end of the day's labor, another simple meal, and then rest, preparing for the exact same sequence of events to unfold the very next day. This unbroken chain of identical days, extending backwards and forwards into the mists of prehistory, forms the fabric of their existence. The very landscape, as viewed by these early agriculturalists, presented a consistent and unchanging panorama. The distant, low-lying hills, if any existed, were merely static features on the horizon, too far to interact with, too bland to inspire. The river, the source of the basin's fertility, flowed with a steady, unhurried current. Its waters a constant, often muddy brown, reflecting the perpetually gray sky above. There were no dramatic waterfalls or turbulent rapids, just the slow, relentless onward movement of water, carrying with it sediment and the occasional piece of floating debris. This river, while essential for life, did not inspire awe or wonder in the way that more dramatic natural phenomena might. It simply was a necessary and ever-present component of their unchanging world. Even the soundscape of this ancient basin was likely one of profound quietude, punctuated by only the most mundane of noises: the soft rustle of wind through dry vegetation, the distant, indistinct calls of a few avian species, their songs utilitarian rather than melodic, the rhythmic scrape of a stone-tipped hoe against earth, the occasional muted conversation, its words primarily focused on the practicalities of the day, the state of the crop, the need for water, the prospect of tomorrow's labor. There was no bustling marketplace, no clanging of metalworking, no shouts of merchants, no joyous celebrations, or sorrowful laments that would dramatically alter the pervasive quiet. It was a world of gentle, almost imperceptible sounds, mirroring the slow, deliberate pace of life itself. The early history of this region, then, is a testament to the unglamorous persistence of human effort. It is a narrative not of innovation and rapid progress, but of the slow, grinding process of adaptation, of incremental adjustments to a challenging, yet largely unchanging environment. The individuals who lived during this period did not leave behind grand monuments or inspiring tales of adventure. Their legacy lies, instead, in the subtle modification of the landscape, in the small, cultivated patches of land that slowly, over countless generations, transformed the wild earth into something slightly more amenable to human sustenance. And even these modifications were so gradual, so diffuse, that they would have been barely perceptible within a single lifetime. It was a change measured not in years or decades, but in centuries, stretching into millennia, an almost geologic slowness that defies easy comprehension. Their understanding of their own history was equally limited. Lacking written records and relying solely on oral traditions, their perception of the past would have been a blurry, indistinct canvas, populated by generalized ancestors and vague cyclical narratives of the seasons and the land. Specific dates and precise events would have held little meaning. The past was simply then a long, undifferentiated stretch of time that was essentially just like now, only perhaps with slightly less effective tools. This lack of a detailed historical consciousness further contributes to the overall sense of timeless monotony that pervades this period. The development of the slightly more sophisticated tools beyond the basic digging stick and proto-hoe continued at this same incredibly slow pace. The next logical, though still profoundly unexciting, step involved the addition of a handle. Not a sculpted, ergonomically designed handle crafted from exotic woods, but simply a longer, more substantial piece of wood attached to the stone or bone blade of the hoe. This allowed the user to work in a slightly more upright position, thereby reducing some of the constant bending that had characterized earlier efforts. This was an improvement, to be sure, but one that merely shifted the points of strain from the lower back to the arms and shoulders. The work remained physical, repetitive, and entirely devoid of any inherent joy or excitement. The method of attaching this handle to the blade was also a point of slow and painstaking evolution. Initially, it would have involved the same rudimentary bindings, sinew, plant fibers, that were prone to degradation and breakage. This necessitated frequent repairs and rebindings, adding another layer of minor but persistent labor to the daily routine. Over time, however, individuals began to experiment with more robust attachment methods. Perhaps a drilled hole in the stone blade, allowing the handle to be inserted and then secured with a peg. Or even a natural split in the wood of the handle that could be wedged around the stone. These were not the products of sophisticated engineering workshops, but rather the result of trial and error, carried out by individuals who were merely trying to make their lives, if not exciting, then at least marginally less physically taxing. The material of the blade itself also underwent a slow, almost imperceptible evolution. While stone and bone remained primary materials for a very long time, the specific types of stone chosen might have varied. Denser, more durable stones, such as basalt or certain types of flint, would have been preferred for their ability to hold an edge and withstand the rigors of repeated impact with the soil. The process of shaping these stone blades was itself a laborious and unglamorous task involving the repeated striking of one stone against another, a technique known as flint knapping or pecking and grinding depending on the material and desired finish. This was not a quick or satisfying process, but rather a slow, deliberate removal of material, requiring patience, and a high degree of precision, or at least a consistent level of imprecision, that eventually led to a usable shape. The sounds of this stone-shaping activity would have been equally monotonous. The dull thud of stone against stone, the occasional sharp crack as a flake detached, the constant, gentle rasping as edges were ground down to a functional, if not aesthetically pleasing, sharpness. These were not the sounds of progress or innovation, but merely the sounds of persistent, methodical labor, aimed at creating a tool that would then be used for more persistent, methodical labor in the fields. The entire chain of activities was one of unremitting, uninspired effort. The early agricultural fields themselves were not vast, geometrically perfect expanses, but rather irregular, patchworked areas carved out from the natural vegetation. The process of clearing new land was perhaps one of the most physically demanding tasks of all. It involved the slow, painstaking removal of trees, shrubs, and undergrowth, often using fire, but also relying on the same simple tools for digging up roots and breaking apart stubborn clumps of earth. The smell of wood smoke, therefore, would have been a common, if not particularly pleasant, an atmospheric component of these early agricultural settlements. The air, perpetually dusty, would occasionally carry the acrid tang of burning vegetation, another reminder of the relentless struggle to make the land productive. Even the crops themselves were, in their early forms, rather unassuming. Wild grasses cultivated over generations gradually transformed into rudimentary forms of grains, wheat, barley, or rice, depending on the specific basin. These early varieties were not the robust, high-yielding strains we know today, but rather fragile, often susceptible plants. Prone to disease and environmental fluctuations, their yields were modest, often barely enough to sustain the population, necessitating a constant, unremitting focus on cultivation and a deeply ingrained caution regarding resource management. The very act of eating, therefore, was not a joyous indulgence, but a practical necessity, repetitive refueling of the body for the next cycle of monotonous labor. And so we continue to dwell upon these minor details, for it is in these very details, their sheer abundance, and their consistent lack of dramatic import, that the true character of this early historical period in the lower riverine basin of the greater western flux truly resides. It is not a period defined by grand pronouncements or heroic struggles, but by the quiet, unremarked passage of countless days, each one in near identical repetition of the last, punctuated only by the slow, almost imperceptible rhythms of the natural world and the equally slow, almost imperceptible refinements of rudimentary tools. The human experience in this context was one of profound, almost overwhelming repetition. The social structures that emerged during this period were predictably as simple and unadorned as their tools. There were no complex hierarchies, no elaborate systems of governance. Decisions were likely made communally or by consensus within small family units or tightly knit clans. The concept of leadership, if it existed at all, would have been based on practical skills. Perhaps the most adept farmer, or the most experienced hunter, or the one with the most consistent understanding of the subtle nuances of weather patterns. There was no room for charismatic orators, no need for grand strategists. Life was too basic, too focused on the immediate demands of survival, to allow for such luxuries. The spiritual beliefs of these early people, while undoubtedly present, were likely equally unrefined and focused on the practicalities of their existence. The fertility of the soil, the predictability of the rains, the health of the crops, these would have been the primary concerns that shaped their nascent spiritual understandings. Rituals, if they were performed, would have been simple, repetitive acts designed to appease benevolent spirits or ward off malevolent ones, all with the singular goal of ensuring a successful harvest and the continued, albeit unexciting, survival of the community. There would have been no elaborate temples or complex theological doctrines, merely a pragmatic approach to the unseen forces that govern their agricultural world. Consider the sheer lack of surplus during this time. Every calorie expended in labor was directly tied to the acquisition of calories for consumption. There was little to no margin for error, little room for experimentation, and certainly no capacity for leisure or artistic pursuits beyond the most basic and functional. The creation of decorative objects, for instance, would have been a rare and time-consuming endeavor, likely limited to simple patterns etched onto utilitarian pottery or basic adornments woven from plant fibers. The concept of art for art's sake, or even storytelling for entertainment, would have been a foreign notion in a world so utterly consumed by the daily grind of survival. The pottery itself, which gradually began to appear as a means of storing grains and liquids, was also functional in the extreme, coarsely made, often hand-coiled without the aid of a potter's wheel. These early vessels were designed for utility, not beauty. Their surfaces were often unglazed, their forms robust and somewhat clunky, intended to withstand the rough handling of daily use rather than to impress with delicate craftsmanship. The colors were typically earthy and muted, reflecting the natural clays from which they were fashioned. Each piece was, in essence, a direct product of the earth, unadorned and unpretentious, serving its purpose with a quiet, unremarked efficiency. The slow advancement of agricultural techniques continued in this vein. Beyond the hoe, another crucial yet equally unexciting innovation slowly emerged. The sickle. Initially, this was simply a curved piece of stone or bone, perhaps with a sharpened edge used for cutting the stalks of grain. Its development was driven by the inefficiency of hand-picking individual grain heads, a task that, while effective, was incredibly time-consuming and labor-intensive. The sickle, even in its most rudimentary form, allowed for a more efficient gathering of the harvest, thereby, in theory, reducing the overall time spent in the fields during the crucial harvesting period. The use of the early sickle involved a repetitive sweeping motion, not unlike the arc of a scythe, though on a much smaller scale. The user would grasp a handful of grain stalks, then, with a steady motion, draw the sharpened edge of the sickle across them, severing the stalks at their base. This action would be repeated over and over again for hours on end, across entire fields of ripened grain. The sound would have been a soft, rustling swish, punctuated by the occasional snap of a particularly tough stalk. Again, no drama, no excitement, just the persistent rhythmic application of a simple tool to a simple task. The design of the sickle, much like the hoe, evolved with excruciating slowness. The stone blades might eventually be hafted into wooden handles, providing a more comfortable grip and better leverage. The curvature of the blade might be subtly refined, based on countless generations of practical experience, to achieve a more efficient cutting action. But these were minor adjustments, incremental improvements that did not fundamentally alter the nature of the work itself. The core task remained the same: cutting grain stalks, one handful at a time, for seemingly endless hours. The very concept of time itself, as experienced by these early people, would have been deeply intertwined with these agricultural cycles. A day was measured by the movement of the sun, a week by the phases of the moon, a year by the predictable progression of the seasons: planting, growing, harvesting, and resting. There was no abstract notion of time disconnected from these natural rhythms. Each moment was lived in direct relation to the demands of the earth and the needs of the crop. Its deep connection to the land, while perhaps grounding, also contributed to the overall sense of unchanging, repetitive existence. Even the development of permanent settlements, which slowly began to replace the more nomadic lifestyles of earlier hunter-gatherers, did not dramatically alter the fundamental monotony. The construction of these early dwellings was, itself, a laborious and repetitive process. Simple structures made from local materials, mud, wattle, and daub reeds, were slowly assembled, piece by piece, by individuals working together in a coordinated yet utterly uninspired fashion. The sounds of construction would have been the squish of mud, the rustle of reeds, the dull thud of logs being put into place. No loud machinery, no complex architectural plans, just the slow, steady effort of building simple shelters that offered basic protection from the elements. These settlements, while providing a degree of stability, did not foster a sudden explosion of social or cultural complexity. They were simply collections of similar, unadorned dwellings, clustered together for mutual protection and shared labor. The daily life within these settlements would have been equally repetitive: the tending of small domestic animals, the grinding of grain, the preparation of meals, the mending of tools, the raising of children. Each activity is a necessary component of survival, each performed with a practical, unembellished efficiency. The early forms of grinding grain, for instance, were incredibly labor-intensive. This involved the use of two stones, a larger flat grinding stone and a smaller rounded hand stone, or mano. The grain, painstakingly harvested, would be placed on the grinding stone, and then the hand stone would be moved back and forth, or in a circular motion, over the grain, slowly crushing it into a coarse flour. The sound of this activity would have been a persistent, gritty rasping, a sound that permeated the domestic spaces of these early settlements for hours each day. The physical effort required was substantial, and the output, a coarse and often inconsistently ground flour, is a testament to the sheer dedication to basic food preparation. This grinding process was not a quick task, nor one that could be easily automated. It was a manual, repetitive chore, often performed by women, that occupied a significant portion of their day. The quality of the flour, and therefore the palatability of the resulting bread or porridge, was directly dependent on the hours spent at the grinding stone. There were no shortcuts, no easy ways to bypass this fundamental, monotonous step in the food production chain. The very sustenance of the community depended on this persistent, unsung labor. And so, we continue to observe these incredibly mundane, yet ultimately essential aspects of early human existence in our chosen basin. The overwhelming impression is one of slow, deliberate persistence, of a relentless dedication to the basic necessities of life, and a profound absence of anything that might be construed as exciting or dramatic. The history unfolds not as a series of peaks and valleys, but as a vast flat plain stretching endlessly into the horizon, each step upon it indistinguishable from the last. The introduction of rudimentary irrigation, for example, represents another slow, incremental development that, while significant for agricultural productivity, was hardly a source of immediate thrill. This involved the gradual digging of small channels or ditches, diverting water from the main river or from seasonal rainwater runoff to the fields. The construction of these channels was once again a laborious process, requiring the same simple digging tools and the persistent application of manual labor. The earth was slowly moved, basket by basket, or simply pushed aside with proto-shovels to create the necessary conduits for water. The maintenance of these irrigation channels was equally unglamorous. It would constantly fill with sediment, requiring regular clearing. They might be damaged by erosion or by the trampling of animals, necessitating repairs. This meant that the work of digging and moving earth was not a one-time endeavor, but a continuous, cyclical task, adding yet another layer of persistent, monotonous labor to the lives of these early farmers. Sight of water slowly, almost reluctantly, flowing down a newly cleared ditch would have been a source of quiet satisfaction, perhaps, but certainly not of ecstatic celebration. It was merely the expected outcome of painstaking effort. The early forms of land ownership, if such a concept can even be applied to this period, would have been equally uninteresting. Perhaps a family would simply claim a patch of land by virtue of having cleared and cultivated it. There would be no complex legal deeds, no intricate systems of inheritance, just the simple understanding that this field belongs to us because we work it. Disputes over land, if they occurred, would likely be resolved through local consensus or, in more extreme cases, through simple acts of intimidation or direct conflict, devoid of any elaborate judicial proceedings. The stakes were too basic, the resources too limited to allow for complex legal frameworks. The daily rhythms of child-rearing would also have been deeply intertwined with these agricultural demands. Children from a young age would have been expected to contribute to the household labor, performing tasks appropriate to their size and strength, gathering firewood, scaring away birds from the fields, assisting with grinding grain, or fetching water. Play, if it existed in any formal sense, would have been brief and simple, using natural objects as toys. There was little concept of a prolonged childhood or an emphasis on formal education. Life was a continuous apprenticeship in survival, taught through observation and direct participation in the never-ending cycle of work. Even the diseases that afflicted these early communities would have contributed to the overall sense of grinding tedium and low-level suffering. Malnutrition, parasitic infections, and the common ailments of poor sanitation would have been constant companions. There were no dramatic plagues that swept through and instantly devastated populations, but rather a persistent, low-level burden of illness that sapped energy, reduced productivity, and made life even more challenging. The methods of treating these ailments would have been equally basic. Herbal remedies, rest, and perhaps the occasional simple surgical procedure, often with limited success. The experience of illness was not a dramatic event, but rather another persistent, debilitating aspect of their unremarkable existence. And so, as we continue to drift through these unhurried details, the picture that emerges is one of a human existence deeply rooted in the earth, shaped by the slow turning of the seasons characterized by an almost overwhelming emphasis on repetition and practical utility. The grandeur of later civilizations, with their monumental architecture and complex social structures, seems utterly remote from this foundational period. Here, in the lower riverine basin, life was lived on a far more basic, far more monotonous plane. The concept of a community itself was not one of diverse roles and specialized professions, but rather a collection of individuals performing largely similar tasks, sharing similar struggles, and bound together by the common goal of collective survival. There was no artisan class producing elaborate goods, no merchant class facilitating complex trade networks, no priestly class officiating over intricate religious ceremonies. Everyone was, to a greater or lesser extent, a farmer, a builder, a gatherer, a preparer of food, a parent. This lack of specialization further contributed to the homogeneous and repetitive nature of daily life. The limited communication between these early communities also played a significant role in maintaining this slow pace of development. Without efficient means of travel or reliable systems for transmitting information over long distances, innovations, once they occurred, would spread at an excruciatingly slow rate. A new technique for hafting a hoe, or a slightly more efficient method for grinding grain, might take generations to travel from one settlement to another, if it traveled at all. This meant that each community, to a large extent, was left to discover and rediscover solutions to basic problems independently, further prolonging the period of rudimentary development. Even the earliest forms of basic counting and record-keeping would have been incredibly simple, focused on practicalities like the number of harvested sacks of grain or the number of days until the next planting season. There would be no complex mathematical systems, no abstract philosophical treatises, just the bare necessities of quantitative understanding applied to the immediate demands of agrarian life. The very act of counting, therefore, was not a source of intellectual curiosity, but a functional tool for managing scarce resources in a consistently unexciting world. The transition from a purely nomadic existence to one of settled agriculture, while transformative in its long-term impact, was not a sudden dramatic shift. It was a gradual process, likely spanning many centuries, during which communities slowly experimented with cultivating wild plants, while still relying on hunting and gathering for a significant portion of their diet. This period of transitional agriculture would have been characterized by an even greater degree of uncertainty and a constant balancing act between the old ways and the new. The introduction of farming was not a clear-cut decision, but a slow, hesitant drift towards a more settled, and ultimately more repetitive way of life. The very landscape, as it was slowly altered by these early agricultural practices, reflected this gradualism. What was once a pristine wild environment would, over generations, become a patchwork of cultivated fields, interspersed with areas of natural vegetation. The edges of these cultivated areas would be blurred and indistinct, slowly expanding outwards as the population grew and the demand for food increased. This was not a sudden deforestation or a dramatic reshaping of the land, but a subtle, almost imperceptible transformation occurring over such long periods that no single generation would have been fully aware of the extent of the change. And so, we bring our initial exploration of this setting, background, and early history to a close. Having lingered upon the monotonous details of sticks, stones, soil, and the slow, unremarked passage of countless identical days, this is the foundation upon which any further history of the lower riverine basin of the greater western flux must inevitably rest. A foundation built not on dramatic events, but on the enduring, unexciting, and utterly repetitive efforts of countless individuals simply striving to survive in a world that offered little in the way of thrill or diversion. The story, such as it is, will continue in this same deliberate, unhurried, and decidedly unexciting fashion, focusing always on the small, unglamorous aspects of human endeavor that truly define existence in this particular historical context. We left our narrative, it will be recalled, at a point where the fundamental aspects of human existence in the lower riverine basin of the greater western flux were characterized by an almost overwhelming emphasis on repetition and practical utility, with the social structures being as simple and unadorned as the rudimentary tools that defined the era The concept of community itself was not one of diverse roles and specialized professions, but rather the collection of individuals performing largely similar tasks, sharing similar struggles, and bound together by the common goal of collective survival, a survival that was by any measure a consistent and unexciting endeavor. The lack of efficient means of travel or reliable systems for transmitting information over long distances meant that innovations, once they occurred, bred at an excruciatingly slow rate, thereby perpetuating the period of rudimentary development and maintaining the pervasive sense of unchanging repetitive existence. Now, as we slowly, almost reluctantly nudge our focus forward in the timeline, we arrive at a period marked by the equally gradual, and therefore equally unexciting, advent of what can only be described as marginally more specialized labor. This was not a sudden burst of industrialization, nor a dramatic restructuring of society, but rather a subtle, almost imperceptible differentiation of tasks that had previously been performed by almost everyone. The process unfolded with a slowness that defies easy quantification, stretching across generations. Each increment of change so minor that it would have been barely noticeable within a single human lifetime. Consider, for example, the slow emergence of individuals who, perhaps, exhibited a slightly greater aptitude for the shaping of stone tools. These individuals, whom we might, with a certain generous stretch of imagination, term specialized flint knappers or pebble shapers, would spend marginally more of their time dedicated to the repetitive process of striking one stone against another. Their tools, while still rudimentary, might have exhibited a slightly higher degree of consistency in their form and functionality compared to those produced by individuals who only occasionally engaged in tool manufacture. The sounds associated with their work, the dull thud, the occasional sharp crack, the incessant rasping of grinding, would have remained largely the same, merely becoming a slightly more constant presence in specific areas of the settlement. The materials themselves, the stones chosen for these tools, would still be sourced locally, often from the riverbeds or from nearby geological outcrops. The act of selecting these stones, a task that remained broadly accessible to all, would involve a repetitive search for suitable raw materials, looking for specific textures, densities, and fracture patterns. The criteria for selection were practical: a stone that could be reliably broken to produce sharp edges, or one that was sufficiently tough to withstand the rigors of digging or cutting. There was no aesthetic consideration, no search for beauty, merely a pragmatic assessment of functional utility. The journey to the river, a slow walk over familiar terrain, would be as uneventful as the return, burdened by a basket of unremarkable stones. The production of pottery, too, began to exhibit a very minor degree of specialization. While most households would continue to produce their own basic vessels for daily use, there might be certain individuals who, through consistent practice, developed a slightly more refined touch. Their pots, while still hand-coiled and unglazed, might be marginally more symmetrical, or possess slightly thinner walls, exhibit a slightly more consistent firing. The process of firing itself remained a simple affair, placing the dried clay vessels in an open pit, surrounding them with fuel, typically wood or dried animal dung, and then setting the fuel alight. The resulting heat, inconsistently distributed and difficult to control, would harden the clay, transforming it into a durable, if not particularly elegant finished product. The aroma of burning organic matter, a familiar scent, would permeate the air during these sporadic firing events. The variations in these pottery products were not dramatic. We are not speaking of intricate designs or vibrant glazes, but rather of subtle differences in the texture of the clay, the consistency of the firing, or the faint, almost accidental patterns left by the potter's fingers during the coiling process. These were not works of art, but objects of utility, their value entirely tied to their capacity to hold grain or water. The discerning eye of a modern archaeologist might note these minor distinctions, but to the people of the lower riverine basin at the time, a pot was simply a pot serving its unexciting purpose with a dependable lack of flair. Even within the realm of agriculture, a very, very minor specialization might have begun to emerge. Certain individuals, perhaps those with a slightly more nuanced understanding of soil conditions or the subtle needs of particular crops, might have been informally consulted on planting schedules or methods of pest control. These agricultural advisors, if one can even grant them such a lofty title, would not have held formal authority or commanded great respect. But their opinions might have carried a marginal weight in discussions that were by their very nature slow, deliberative, and entirely lacking in any dramatic tension. Their advice would have been offered in a low, even tone, focusing on observations that were too most self-evident and unremarkable. The pest control of the era, it must be noted, was equally unexciting. It primarily involved the manual removal of insects and weeds, a task performed by hand, or with the help of the ubiquitous digging stick. Flocks of birds might be scared away with shouts and arm-waving, a repetitive and often frustrating activity that yielded only temporary results. There were no sophisticated chemicals, no intricate traps, just the constant, low-level battle against nature's persistent attempts to reclaim the cultivated land, but a continuous grinding attrition, punctuated by small, temporary successes and equally small, temporary setbacks. The slow formation of trade routes, or rather, the occasional exchange of goods between adjacent settlements, also unfolded at a pace that could be described as lethargic. These exchanges were not driven by market forces or the desire for exotic luxuries, but by the practical need for materials not locally available, or perhaps by a slight surplus of one commodity in exchange for another. A settlement rich in a particular type of flint might exchange it for clay from another, or perhaps for a small quantity of salt, a rare and valued commodity. The journeys undertaken for these exchanges would be slow, arduous, and entirely uneventful. Following well-worn paths through familiar, uninspiring landscapes, the goods exchanged were, predictably, as unexciting as everything else. Raw materials, simple tools, perhaps a small quantity of dried foodstuffs, or basic woven textiles. There were no elaborate works of art, no precious metals, no exotic spices. The value of an item was determined by its utility and its scarcity, not by its aesthetic appeal or its capacity to inspire wonder. The act of bartering itself would be a slow, deliberate negotiation, conducted with a quiet solemnity, each side attempting to gain a marginal advantage in an exchange of goods that were, to both parties, fundamentally mundane. Consider the occasional instances of minor social friction within a settlement. Perhaps a disagreement over the boundaries of a field or a perceived unfair distribution of a communal resource. These conflicts, if one can even elevate them to such a term, would not be resolved through dramatic courtroom battles or passionate appeals, but through long, drawn-out discussions, punctuated by silences, and eventually a slow, often grudging consensus. The outcome would rarely be a clear victory for one side, but rather a compromise that satisfied no one completely, that allowed the relentless, repetitive rhythm of daily life to resume its course. There were no passionate speeches, no eloquent arguments, just the slow, deliberate weighing of pragmatic concerns. Even the process of burial, a universal human ritual, was characterized by a certain simplicity and lack of ostentation. When an individual passed away, the body would be prepared with basic rituals, perhaps wrapped in simple textiles, and then interred in a shallow grave, often near the settlement or in a designated unremarkable burial ground. Grave goods, if present at all, would be minimal and functional. A few everyday tools, some pottery, perhaps a small quantity of food for the afterlife. There were no grand tombs, no elaborate monuments, just the quiet, dignified, an entirely unexciting act of returning a body to the earth. A process that was itself a part of the slow, inevitable cycle of life and death. The sense of loss, while undoubtedly present, was often expressed with a quiet resignation, another inevitable, if somber, aspect of their unchanging world. The slow, gradual accumulation of knowledge about the natural world also continued, driven by practical necessity rather than intellectual curiosity. The precise timing of the seasons, the subtle indicators of impending weather changes, the medicinal properties of certain plants, these were observations that were slowly, painstakingly gathered over generations, passed down through oral tradition. This knowledge was not codified into scientific treatises, but rather existed as a diffuse, practical understanding applied to the immediate demands of survival. It was a form of knowledge that merely facilitated the continuation of monotonous tasks, rather than offering any dramatic new insights or intellectual revelations. The development of simple shelters, as mentioned, progressed at a similarly unhurried pace. From basic wattle and daub structures, there might have been a gradual, almost imperceptible shift towards slightly more robust construction methods, perhaps the use of more carefully selected timber for support beams, or a slightly more refined technique for mixing mud for walls, resulting in dwellings that were marginally more durable or offered marginally better protection from the elements. The overall aesthetic, however, remained one of unadorned functionality. These were homes, not palaces, designed for shelter and basic living. It's not for architectural grandeur or personal expression. Each new dwelling, while perhaps a source of quiet pride for its builders, was largely indistinguishable from its neighbors, contributing to the overall sense of uniform, repetitive settlement. The domestic routines within these slowly evolving settlements remained fundamentally unchanged. The grinding of grain, the preparation of simple meals over an open fire, the mending of clothing made from animal skins or coarse plant fibers, the care of young children. These were the constant, repetitive tasks that filled the hours of each day. The sounds of these domestic activities would have been low and consistent. The rasping of grinding stones, the crackle of fire, the quiet murmurs of conversation, the occasional cry of a child quickly soothed. There was no bustling activity, no vibrant cacophony, just the steady hum of unexciting daily life. Even the development of rudimentary weaving, which slowly emerged as a means of producing textiles beyond simple animal skins, followed this pattern of slow, incremental progress. The fibers gathered from wild plants or from the earliest domesticated flax would be painstakingly prepared, processed, and then woven on basic looms, often just a simple frame or a series of pegs driven into the ground. The resulting fabric would be coarse and utilitarian, suitable for clothing or simple coverings, but lacking any intricate patterns or delicate textures. The act of weaving itself was repetitive and time-consuming, a further extension of the monotonous labor that defined their existence. The colors of these early textiles would be equally muted, derived from natural dyes extracted from plants, browns, greens, ochres, and dull reds. There were no vibrant hues, no intricate tapestries, just the subtle, earthy tones that blended seamlessly with the natural landscape and the overall lack of visual excitement. The clothing produced from these textiles would be simple in cut and design, offering basic modesty and protection rather than serving as a form of personal expression or social distinction. Everyone dressed similarly, in similarly uninspired garments, further reinforcing the pervasive sense of homogeneity. The occasional visits from individuals from distant, though still geographically proximate, communities would have been infrequent and largely uneventful. These visitors would not bring news of grand empires or dramatic events, but perhaps information about the harvest in their own basin, or a slightly different technique for making a certain tool, or a new variety of wild edible plant discovered in their territory. These exchanges, while providing a minor diversion, not fundamentally alter the slow, repetitive rhythm of life in the host settlement. The conversations would be conducted in a quiet, deliberate manner, focusing on the practicalities of their shared existence. The development of basic forms of storage beyond simply burying food in the ground also progressed at a snail's pace. The use of large, unadorned pottery vessels, or pits lined with clay or stone, allowed for the slightly more efficient preservation of surplus grain or dried foodstuffs. This marginal improvement in storage capacity, while important for long-term survival, did not lead to a sudden accumulation of wealth or a dramatic transformation of the social order. It merely meant that the community had a slightly better chance of surviving periods of scarcity, allowing the monotonous cycle of planting and harvesting to continue without dramatic interruptions. The earliest forms of rudimentary defense, as settlements grew marginally larger, were equally unexciting. Perhaps a simple palisade made from roughly cut logs, or a shallow ditch dug around the periphery of the settlement. These defenses were not designed to repel large organized armies, but merely to offer a basic deterrent against opportunistic raiders or wild animals. Their construction was, again, a laborious and repetitive task, involving the felling of trees with stone axes, the digging of trenches with proto-shovels, and the slow, steady erection of defensive structures, while the feeling of security provided by these defenses was likely modest. A subtle reduction in anxiety rather than a profound sense of safety. The reasons for these early conflicts, or rather, the occasional instances of inter-group aggression, would have been equally prosaic. Competition over scarce resources, a particularly fertile patch of land, access to a reliable water source, or a valuable deposit of flint would be the primary drivers. These were not wars of conquest or ideological clashes, but rather localized skirmishes, fought with simple weapons, sharpened sticks, stone axes, crude slings, resulting in small casualties and no lasting dramatic impact on the broader historical narrative. The violence, when it occurred, was direct, brutal, and entirely lacking in any heroic grandeur. The passage of seasons continued its unhurried march, each year bringing with it the predictable cycle of planting and harvesting. The subtleties of weather patterns, the nuances of soil conditions, the vagaries of plant growth, these were the constant companions of the agriculturalists, demanding their attention, yet offering little in the way of surprise or dramatic incident. A particularly dry spell might lead to a slightly poorer harvest. A period of heavy rains might make the fields muddier and harder to work. But these were variations on a theme rather than fundamental disruptions. The story remained one of slow, steady persistence against the backdrop of an indifferent natural world. The development of tools for clearing land also continued at this agonizingly slow pace. While fire remained an important method for initial land clearance, the use of larger, heavier stone axes for felling trees and chopping wood gradually became more prevalent. These axes, still rudimentary, were crafted with significant effort, their heavy stone heads hafted into sturdy wooden handles. The act of felling a tree with such an axe was a laborious, repetitive process, involving countless blows, each one chipping away at the wood until the tree slowly, inevitably, succumbed. The sound of stone axe against wood, a dull thudding punctuated by the occasional splintering crack, would have been another pervasive, unexciting auditory component of their daily lives. The role of animal domestication, initially centered around dogs for hunting and protection, also slowly expanded to include other species, particularly those that could provide milk, meat, and labor. The earliest domesticated sheep and goats, for instance, were not the highly productive breeds we know today, but rather hardy, relatively small animals. Providing modest quantities of resources, the care of these animals involved a repetitive set of tasks: herding them to pasture, protecting them from predators, milking them, a simple, manual process, and eventually slaughtering them for meat. The sounds of these animals, the bleating of sheep, the gentle lowing of cattle, the clucking of early domesticated fowl, would have added a new, yet still unexciting, layer to the soundscape of the settlements. The process of early cheesemaking, if it occurred, would have been equally basic and unexciting. Milk, collected from domesticated animals, would be allowed to curdle, perhaps with the addition of rennet from an animal's stomach, or simply by natural souring. The curds would then be separated from the whey, pressed, and allowed to age, resulting in a simple, often hard and salty cheese. This was not a delicate culinary art, but a pragmatic method of preserving milk, extending its utility and providing another source of sustenance that was, by its very nature, uninspired and functional. The flavors would be simple, direct, and entirely lacking in any gourmet complexity. Even the early forms of counting, as mentioned previously, remained focused on the practical and the mundane. Small stones or notches on a stick would be used to keep track of harvests, livestock numbers, or the passage of days. These were not abstract mathematical exercises, but tangible, physical representations of quantities directly relevant to survival. The act of counting was not a joyous exploration of numerical patterns, but a necessary chore, a repetitive tallying that ensured resources were adequately managed in a world of consistent scarcity. The very concept of progress during this period would have been largely absent from the minds of the people living it. They were not striving towards a grand vision of a better future, but simply enduring the present, trying to ensure that the next harvest would be sufficient, that the next winter would be survived, that the daily cycle of labor and sustenance would continue unbroken. Progress, when it occurred, was a byproduct of persistent effort, not the result of conscious, aspirational planning. It was a slow, almost accidental drift forward, rather than a deliberate, focused march. The passage of generations, therefore, brought with it only subtle shifts. Grandparents would recall a world that was marginally less developed than their grandchildren's. But the differences would be so minor, so understated, that they would barely warrant remark. The stories passed down would not be of dramatic societal transformations, but of subtle changes in tool design or marginally better farming techniques, or a particularly challenging dry season that was eventually overcome. The narrative of their past was a slow, continuous drone, devoid of sharp contrasts or sudden turning points. Even the occasional minor environmental shifts would contribute to this pervasive sense of unremarkableness. A slight change in the river's course, slowly eroding one bank and depositing sediment on another, would necessitate gradual adjustments to irrigation channels or field boundaries. A minor fluctuation in average rainfall over several decades might lead to subtle changes in crop selection or planting strategies. These were not catastrophic events, but slow, almost imperceptible alterations, demanding equally slow and imperceptible human adaptations. The landscape itself, while subtly changing, maintained its overall character of dusty, low-lying plains and uninspired river flow. The early forms of music, if they existed, would also have been deeply intertwined with the rhythms of daily life and labor. Simple, percussive sounds, the clapping of hands, the beating of sticks against hollow logs, might accompany repetitive tasks, providing a subtle, monotonous cadence to the work. Basic vocalizations, perhaps repetitive chants or hums, could have served a similar purpose, or been used in simple, unadorned rituals. There were no complex melodies, no intricate harmonies, just the most basic and functional forms of sound production. Reflecting the utilitarian nature of their entire existence, the soundscape was not one of rich cultural expression, but a functional background noise, a subtle hum accompanying the relentless march of daily life. The concept of leisure in the modern sense was virtually non-existent. Any moment not dedicated to direct subsistence activities, farming, gathering, building, preparing food, would likely be spent in rest recuperating, from the physical demands of labor or in simple communal interactions that reinforced social bonds without necessarily providing entertainment. The idea of structured recreation or pursuits engaged in purely for pleasure is a luxury that the people of the lower riverine basin simply could not afford. In a world where every effort was directly tied to survival, the social interactions themselves would be characterized by a certain pragmatism and directness. There would be little room for elaborate rhetoric or complex social maneuvering. Communication would be functional, focused on the immediate tasks at hand or the sharing of basic information relevant to the community's well-being. Jokes, if they existed, would be simple and earthy, focused on shared experiences of labor or the vagaries of nature. Emotions, while undoubtedly present, would often be expressed with a quiet restraint, perhaps overshadowed by the constant demands of their challenging, yet unchanging, existence. The slow, gradual accumulation of tools beyond the most basic implements continued its unhurried march. The development of simple fishing hooks, perhaps made from bone or carefully shaped thorns, allowed for a slightly more efficient exploitation of the river's resources. The creation of rudimentary nets woven from plant fibers further enhanced fishing capabilities. These innovations, while important for dietary diversification, did not fundamentally alter the character of labor. Fishing, like farming, remained a repetitive, often patient activity, punctuated by small, consistent successes rather than dramatic triumphs. The sight of a fish caught and brought to shore was a practical addition to the food supply, not a moment of exhilarating conquest. Even the initial exploration of the immediate surroundings beyond the known cultivated areas would have been undertaken with a cautious pragmatism, not an adventurous spirit. Short excursions into nearby forests or hills would be driven by the need for specific resources: wood, medicinal plants, perhaps wild game. These explorations would be slow, methodical, and entirely without dramatic encounters. The landscape beyond the basin, while perhaps slightly more varied, would still be experienced through the lens of utility and survival rather than aesthetic appreciation or a thirst for the unknown. The emergence of leaders or individuals with slightly more influence within the community continued to be based on practical competence rather than inherited status or charismatic appeal. An individual who consistently produced good harvests or who demonstrated reliable judgment in managing communal resources might slowly accumulate a minor degree of informal authority. Its authority, however, would be limited, easily challenged, and always contingent on continued practical success. There were no kings or queens, no intricate systems of political succession, just the fluid, practical leadership of individuals who were perceived as marginally more competent in the face of daily challenges. The slow development of simple forms of personal adornment also followed this pattern of utilitarianism. Beads made from shells or small stones, strung together on plant fibers, might be worn, serving perhaps as minor talismans or simple indicators of personal status. These were not elaborate pieces of jewelry, but basic, unpretentious decorations, crafted with limited tools and even more limited time. Their aesthetic appeal was minimal, their primary function likely tied to very basic social signaling or symbolic meaning. The history of the lower riverine basin, therefore, during this extended period, is less a narrative of events and more a chronicle of persistent, unexciting patterns. It is the story of endless days melting into endless weeks, which in turn blend into endless years. Each cycle bringing with it the same fundamental challenges, met with the same fundamental, if incrementally refined, solutions. The individual lives that comprise this history were, for the most part, lived in quiet anonymity. Their stories lost to the mists of time, precisely because they contained so little that was unique, so little that was dramatic, so little that was worth remembering beyond the practicalities of their enduring, monotonous existence. The sounds of the settlements, as these slow shifts occurred, would subtly change, but the overall character of quietude and functional noise would remain. The occasional faint clinking of stone tools, the consistent rasp of grinding, the low murmurs of conversation, the calls of domesticated animals, the crackle of fires, these were the constant components of an auditory landscape that was, much like the visual one, profoundly unexciting. There was no sudden influx of new sounds, no dramatic shifts in the acoustic environment, just the steady, predictable hum of life continuing in its unhurried fashion. The architecture of the settlements, too, continued its uninspired progression. While dwellings might become slightly larger or more robust, their basic form and function remained unchanged. Walls of mud and wattle, roofs of thatch or packed earth, simple doorways and small unglazed openings for light and ventilation. There was no concept of monumental civic architecture, no grand public spaces designed for assembly or ceremony, just the utilitarian clusters of homes, storage structures, and perhaps a small communal gathering area that was itself just an open, unremarkable space. Each building was a testament to patient, repetitive labor, not to architectural innovation or artistic vision. The preparation of food, from the harvesting of grains to the consumption of the final meal, remained a long, multi-step process. Threshing the grain to separate the kernels from the stalks, winnowing it, to remove chaff, grinding it into flour, mixing the flour with water to make dough, and then baking it over an open fire. Each step was laborious, time-consuming, and entirely devoid of any culinary excitement. The resulting food was sustenance, pure and simple, fulfilling the basic physiological needs of the body, rather than providing any gastronomic pleasure or cultural significance beyond its primary function. The repetitive act of eating, therefore, was merely another part of the cycle of survival, a practical refueling for the next round of unexciting labor. The role of fire, a fundamental element of human life, also contributed to the repetitive routines. The gathering of firewood, a continuous task, involved slow excursions into nearby forests or scrublands, collecting dead branches and fallen timber. The meticulous tending of hearth fires, ensuring they remained lit for cooking and warmth, was another daily chore, demanding constant attention without offering any particular drama. The smell of wood smoke, a constant background aroma, would be another unremarked upon component of their sensory environment, simply confirming the ongoing presence of human activity. The collective memory of these communities, as it slowly formed, would not be a detailed historical record, but a diffuse, almost mythical understanding of the past. Stories passed down orally would focus on the origins of their customs, the practicalities of their farming techniques, and the enduring nature of the land and the river. Specific dates, names of individuals, or details of events would blur and fade, leaving behind only the broad, unchanging patterns of existence. Their history was a slow, continuous river, flowing imperceptibly, without dramatic rapids or sudden bends. The very concept of personal identity within this context would have been deeply intertwined with the collective. An individual was primarily a member of a family, a clan, a community, defined by their role in the shared struggle for survival rather than by unique accomplishments or personal aspirations. There was little room for individualistic expression or the pursuit of personal glory. Life was a communal endeavor, demanding conformity and cooperation rather than individual distinction. This further contributed to the homogeneous and repetitive character of their existence. The slow development of simple containers beyond pottery also deserves a brief, unexciting mention. Woven baskets, crafted from reeds or other plant fibers, provided lightweight and flexible storage solutions for various goods, from gathered wild edibles to seeds. The act of weaving these baskets was another repetitive, time-consuming craft, demanding patience and a steady hand. The patterns, if any, would be simple and geometric, dictated by the limitations of the weaving technique and the desire for functional strength rather than artistic flair. Each basket, like each pot, was a testament to utility, not beauty. The presence of domestic animals, as they became more integrated into the daily routines, introduced a new, yet still unexciting set of tasks. The mucking out of pens, the cleaning of animal waste, the constant vigilance against disease. These were the ongoing, unglamorous chores associated with animal husbandry. The benefits in terms of milk, meat, and labor were essential for survival. But the daily reality of caring for these animals was simply another layer of persistent, monotonous effort, adding to the already extensive list of uninspired tasks, the gradual wearing down of tools through constant use, and the subsequent need for repair or replacement also formed a continuous cycle of low-level maintenance. A stone axe might chip, requiring resharpening or a new blade. A hoe handle might break, necessitating its replacement. These were not dramatic failures, but the inevitable consequences of persistent use, demanding minor but consistent efforts to keep the essential implements of life functional. The sounds of minor repairs, the gentle tapping of stone, the scraping of wood, would occasionally punctuate the general quietude. And so, we continue to dwell within this remarkably unremarkable period, tracing the contours of a history that resolutely refuses to provide any dramatic turns or thrilling narratives. It is a history that flows with the slow, steady current of the river itself, a current that carries sediment and debris, but rarely anything of striking beauty or profound significance. The people of the lower riverine basin lived lives of quiet, persistent labor, their contributions measured not in grand achievements, but in the steady continuation of the agricultural cycle, the slow, almost imperceptible refinement of their tools, and the enduring, unexciting rhythm of their daily existence. The concept of a year, as it passed for these early agriculturalists, was not a calendar marked by significant events or holidays of great festivity. Each year was, in essence, a repetition of the last, distinguished only by minor variations in weather patterns or slight fluctuations in crop yields. The planting season arrived, demanding its consistent labor. The growing season followed, requiring patient vigilance. The harvest season, while bringing the crucial bounty, also brought with it intense, prolonged physical exertion. And then, the leaner winter months, characterized by resource management and preparation for the next cycle. This cyclical nature of time reinforced the pervasive sense of repetition and unchanging routine. Even the very act of thinking for these early people would have been largely practical and task-oriented. Abstract philosophical contemplation, or the pursuit of purely intellectual endeavors, would have been a luxury they could not afford. Their minds would be focused on the immediate problems of survival. How to ensure a good harvest, how to protect their crops from pests, how to make their tools slightly more efficient, how to keep their families fed and sheltered. Their mental landscape was as unadorned and functional as their physical one. The occasional discovery of a particularly useful plant or a new source of raw material would be a minor pragmatic event. A new type of berry might be found to be edible, providing a small dietary supplement. A previously unknown deposit of clay might be located, offering a fresh source for pottery. These were not moments of scientific breakthrough, but simple, utilitarian observations, slowly integrated into the existing body of practical knowledge, further enabling the continuation of their unexciting, subsistence-based lives. The role of dreams within this context is also likely to have been similarly uninspired. While undoubtedly present, their content would likely reflect the daily struggles and concerns, dreams of abundant harvests, or perhaps anxieties about crop failure or the loss of livestock. There would be no grand symbolic narratives, no fantastical journeys, just the subconscious processing of the mundane realities of their waking lives. Even their inner worlds would remain tethered to the persistent, unexciting demands of their existence. The slow development of basic medicinal practices continued its unhurried pace, driven by the constant presence of minor ailments and injuries. The knowledge of which plants possessed healing properties, or which simple procedures could alleviate pain, would be slowly accumulated and passed down. These were not sophisticated medical interventions, but pragmatic attempts to manage discomfort and prevent more serious complications, often with limited success. The healing process itself would be slow, uncertain, and entirely lacking in any dramatic cures or miraculous recoveries. And so, the narrative continues to unfold with this persistent, almost wearisome emphasis on the mundane. The history of the lower Riverine Basin is not a story of dynamic change or dramatic progress, but rather a testament to the sheer inertia of human existence when confronted with the fundamental demands of survival. It is a history of slow, incremental shifts, each one barely perceptible, adding up over countless generations to a picture of enduring, unglamorous persistence. We immerse ourselves in the quiet drone of their daily lives, the repetitive actions, the uninspired tools, the unchanging landscape, allowing the soothing monotony to envelop us entirely. The gradual establishment of more defined roles for individuals, beyond the vague specializations mentioned earlier, would still be focused on very practical needs. Perhaps individuals whose eyesight remained sharp into old age would be tasked with the repetitive chore of weaving fine fibers or repairing intricate basketry. Those with steady hands might be relied upon for the delicate work of repairing broken tools or crafting small, useful implements. These were not prestigious positions, but rather functional assignments, based on perceived competence in very specific, often tedious tasks. Their daily routines would remain largely unchanged, merely shifting the focus of their repetitive labor. The very concept of a celebration during this period would also be deeply intertwined with the agrarian cycle, a successful harvest. While a cause for quiet relief and perhaps a communal meal, slightly more abundant than usual, would not involve boisterous festivities or elaborate rituals. It would be a moment of collective breathing out, a temporary respite from the most intense periods of labor, before the focus shifted inevitably to the next set of demanding tasks. There were no grand festivals, no prolonged periods of revelry, just the brief, understated acknowledgement of a crucial milestone achieved in the unexciting march of the year, the slow, almost imperceptible improvement in the quality of their food. As domesticated crops became slightly more robust and animal husbandry marginally more efficient, would be another unremarked upon development. While their diet remained basic, the frequency of severe hunger might have slightly decreased, leading to a subtle increase in overall health and energy levels. This was not a sudden abundance, but a very gradual alleviation of constant scarcity, a shift from extreme precariousness to mere precariousness. The taste of their food, while perhaps slightly more varied, would remain simple and earthy, focused on sustenance. The occasional presence of wild animals, whether for hunting or as a threat to crops and livestock, would also contribute to the persistent low-level vigilance that characterized their lives. The need to protect fields from foraging deer or wild pigs, or to guard domesticated animals from predators, would necessitate constant, unexciting observation. Hunting, while providing valuable protein, was often a patient, arduous affair, involving long hours of waiting, and tracking, punctuated by brief, intense, but rarely dramatic moments of pursuit. The meat, when obtained, was a practical addition to the diet, not a source of heroic tales. The continuous struggle against the elements, particularly the slow process of erosion in the riverine basin, would demand ongoing repetitive efforts. The river, in its slow meanderings, would constantly reshape its banks, requiring farmers to adapt their fields or to construct rudimentary embankments to protect cultivated areas. This was a battle of attrition against natural forces, not a dramatic confrontation, but a persistent, low-level struggle that added another layer of endless, unexciting maintenance to their daily lives. The sight of slowly eroding soil, or the gradual buildup of silt, was a familiar and unremarked-upon phenomenon. And so, we continue to allow the narrative to drift, following the unhurried currents of time in the lower riverine basin. The story remains one of profound, almost overwhelming consistency and repetition. It's the insignificant events, the long expressions, the detailed descriptions of minor aspects. These are the threads from which this long, monotonous tapestry of early history is woven. There is no climax, no rising action, no dramatic conclusion, just the steady, unceasing flow of time, carrying with it the persistent, unexciting realities of human existence. The goal is not to illuminate with flashes of insight, but to immerse the listener in the calming, sleep-inducing drone of an ancient world where nothing much by modern standards ever really happened. The further development of simple tools, always with an emphasis on utility over aesthetics, included such mundane items as rudimentary scoops and ladles, carved from wood or fashioned from hardened gourds. These facilitated the handling of grain, water, or cooked food, marginally improving efficiency in basic domestic tasks. Their designs were simple, their forms dictated by their function, and their crafting involved repetitive acts of carving, scraping, or shaping. The resulting objects were practical, unadorned, and entirely unremarkable, contributing to the overall sense of pervasive, unexciting utility. The slow process of observing the stars, not for abstract astronomical knowledge, but for practical calendrical purposes, would have also been a repetitive, nighttime activity. The consistent reappearance of certain constellations at particular times of the year would serve as markers for the changing seasons, guiding the timing of planting and harvesting. This was not a quest for cosmic understanding, but a pragmatic form of celestial clock-watching, ensuring the continuous, unexciting adherence to the agricultural cycle. The night sky, while vast, would be viewed through the lens of utilitarian observation, rather than poetic wonder. The development of simple shelters for domesticated animals, beyond merely corralling them, would also represent a slow, practical evolution. Basic enclosures, constructed from woven branches or rough timber, would provide protection from predators and the elements. Their construction, like everything else, was a laborious, repetitive task. Adding to the ongoing demands of building and maintaining the settlement, these animal shelters were as unadorned and functional as the human dwellings, serving their purpose without any aesthetic pretensions. The slow process of clearing land for agriculture, as the population gradually increased, expanded the cultivated areas in a quiet, unremarked fashion. The edges of the fields, as we were observing, would subtly and gradually expand outwards, a process so slow and so diffused across generations that no single individual would have perceived it as a significant or remarkable change within their own lifetime. It was merely the slow, inevitable creep of cultivation, consuming small portions of the uncultivated landscape year after year, adding minuscule increments to the already extensive stretches of repetitive agrarian labor. This expansion was not a dramatic territorial conquest, but a quiet, almost reluctant encroachment driven by the persistent, unyielding demand for more sustenance for a slowly, almost imperceptibly growing population. The tools employed for this expansion remained fundamentally unchanged. The heavy, stone-headed axes continued their laborious work of felling trees, each slow, deliberate blow producing a dull thud and the occasional splintering crack that punctuated the otherwise profound quietude of the land-clearing process. The proto-shovels and digging sticks continued their equally slow and laborious task of uprooting stubborn vegetation and preparing the newly cleared soil for planting. This work was, by its very nature, exhausting and repetitive, demanding consistent physical effort without offering any particular moments of satisfaction beyond the gradual, incremental progress of transforming a wild space into a cultivated one. The process of preparing a newly cleared field for its first planting was itself a long, multi-stage, and utterly unexciting endeavor. First, the removal of the felled trees and larger pieces of vegetation, often by dragging or rolling them to the edge of the field, or by slowly burning them in situ, adding the familiar, acrid temps of wood smoke to the perpetually dusty air. Then, the painstaking removal of smaller debris, roots, stones, stubborn clumps of earth, often by hand, or with the aid of the digging stick, ensures a relatively clear surface for the seeds. This was followed by the initial tilling of the soil, often accomplished with the same hose and digging sticks, slowly breaking up the compacted earth and preparing a shallow seedbed. Each of these steps was a repetitive chore, requiring patience, physical endurance, and a profound tolerance for monotony. The soil in these newly cleared areas, often different in composition from the older, long-cultivated fields, might require specific, though equally unexciting, adaptations. Perhaps it was slightly rockier, demanding even more persistent effort in stone removal, or perhaps it was denser, requiring more vigorous application of the hose. These minor variations added complexity to the labor without adding any particular drama or intellectual challenge. It was merely a slightly different texture of earth to be contended with, a marginally altered degree of physical exertion to be expended. The farmers adapted, slowly, methodically, and without any sense of particular urgency. The development of simple methods for soil replenishment, beyond the basic understanding of following a field, leaving it unplanted, for a period to allow its fertility to return naturally, also proceeded with a slowness that defies easy description. The occasional incorporation of animal waste into the soil, or the burning of dried plant matter and spreading the ashes, would have been minor practical attempts to maintain the land's productivity. These were not sophisticated agricultural sciences, but rudimentary, empirically derived practices, adopted slowly and inconsistently, without any clear understanding of the underlying biochemical processes. The results were subtle, often barely perceptible improvements in yield, which served to prolong the life of the fields rather than to dramatically transform their productivity. The seasonal cycle continued its predictable, unvarying rhythm. The rains would come, or they would be scarce. The sun would shine, or it would be obscured by a consistently gray sky. These environmental variables, while crucial to the success of their agricultural endeavors, were not experienced as dramatic events, but as the expected, if sometimes challenging, background against which the monotonous work of farming unfolded. A particularly good harvest year might bring with it a temporary, quiet sense of relief, a slight easing of the constant anxiety over sustenance. A poor harvest year would bring renewed, low-level anxiety and the need for even more stringent rationing, but without dramatic despair or widespread social upheaval. Life simply became marginally harder, demanding even greater persistence in the face of scarcity. The maintenance of rudimentary irrigation systems, as the network of channels slowly, almost imperceptibly, expanded to accommodate the growing cultivated area, became an increasingly significant and equally monotonous task. The constant dredging of silt, the repair of crumbling banks, the clearing of encroaching vegetation, these were perpetual chores, demanding regular attention and adding another layer of physical labor to the daily routine. The sight of water, slowly, deliberately, flowing through these channels to the parched fields was a familiar and unremarked scene, testament to the ongoing low-level struggle against the persistent threat of drought. The sounds associated with these irrigation efforts were as unexciting as the work itself. The gentle sloshing of water, the soft scrape of tools against mud, the occasional faint splash as a small section of a bank was repaired. These were not the sounds of mighty engineering feats, but the quiet, persistent noises of human beings engaged in a patient, unending struggle to control and direct the natural flow of water for their utilitarian purposes. The overall effect was one of pervasive quietude, punctuated by the subtle sounds of repetitive labor. The continued use of fire for various purposes, cooking, land clearance, pottery firing, meant that the smell of wood smoke remained a constant, unremarked upon component of the sensory environment in and around the settlements. This was not the evocative aroma of a festive bonfire, but the familiar, everyday scent of necessity, a subtle reminder of the continuous effort required to maintain a basic level of comfort and functionality in their lives. The smoke, often rising in thin, wispy columns, would blend seamlessly with the perpetually dusty air, forming an almost invisible, yet ever-present part of the landscape. The internal dynamics of the settlements, as they grew marginally larger over time, continued to be characterized by a profound lack of dramatic events. Social interactions remained largely functional, focused on the practicalities of daily life and the coordination of communal labor. Discussions, when they occurred, would still be slow, deliberate, often punctuated by long silences, eventually leading to a quiet consensus or a grudging acceptance of a compromise. There were no grand debates, no impassioned speeches, just the practical exchange of information and opinions necessary for the smooth, unexciting functioning of the community. The concept of elder, or council of elders, might have slowly coalesced during this period, with older individuals valued for their accumulated practical experience and their long memories of seasonal patterns and past challenges being informally consulted on important decisions. Their wisdom was not based on abstract philosophical insight, but on a lifetime of observing the mundane realities of their environment and the consistent rhythms of agricultural life. Their advice would be delivered in a slow, measured tone, often drawing upon anecdotal experiences that were, to most, self-evident and unremarkable. Their authority was based on a quiet respect for their accumulated knowledge of the unexciting past. Even the sporadic instances of minor innovations, which occurred at an agonizingly slow pace, were rarely the result of deliberate invention or intellectual breakthrough. More often, they were the product of accidental discovery. Combined with iterative refinement over countless generations, perhaps a slightly more effective binding for a tool handle was discovered, when a new type of plant fiber was used, or a marginally more efficient way to grind grain was stumbled upon by an individual seeking to reduce their daily labor. These were not moments of sudden revelation, but the quiet, almost imperceptible accumulation of practical knowledge, each step a minor, unglamorous improvement on what came before. The physical appearance of the people themselves would remain largely unchanged over these extended periods. Their clothing, made from coarse natural fibers or animal skins, would continue to be utilitarian and unadorned, providing basic protection from the elements without any particular stylistic flair. Their bodies would bear the marks of consistent physical labor. Calloused hands, stooped shoulders, reflecting the relentless demands of their agrarian existence. Their faces, weathered by sun and wind, would express a quiet endurance, a deep familiarity with the monotonous realities of their lives. There was no concept of fashion, no dramatic changes in attire, just the consistent, functional wearing of similar garments across all individuals. The slow accumulation of basic possessions within households would also continue its unhurried pace. A few more pots, a slightly better grinding stone, a more robust set of tools. These would be the tangible signs of a family's incremental, unexciting progress. These possessions were valued for their utility and their contribution to the efficiency of daily tasks, not for their aesthetic appeal or their capacity to impress others. Each new item was a practical addition to a life fundamentally defined by practical necessities. The gradual development of rudimentary methods for preserving food beyond simple drying or storage in pits, such as salting or smoking meat and fish, would represent another slow, practical evolution. These techniques, discovered through trial and error over generations, allowed for a slightly longer shelf life for perishable goods, providing a marginally greater degree of food security. The processes involved were laborious and repetitive. The careful application of salt, the slow, consistent exposure to smoke, but the resulting preserved food was a valuable, if unexciting, contribution to their sustenance, allowing the monotonous cycle of life to continue with slightly fewer interruptions. The sounds associated with these early preservation methods were equally mundane. The rhythmic rubbing of salt onto meat, the quiet sizzling of fat as meat was dried near a fire, the persistent, low crackle of a smoking pit. These were the background noises of an existence deeply focused on the practicalities of food. There was no culinary artistry, no gastronomic exploration, just the persistent, uninspired effort to make food last longer, to stretch scarce resources, and to ensure the continuous, unexciting rhythm of daily meals. The interaction with the river, the lifeblood of the basin, continued to be one of profound utility. It provided water for drinking and irrigation, and a source of fish and other aquatic resources. The river itself, in its slow, meandering flow, was a constant, predictable presence, its waters often muddy and uninviting, reflecting the perpetually gray sky above. There were no dramatic river voyages, no grand explorations of its distant reaches. Just the continuous, mundane interaction of drawing water, fishing, and maintaining the vital irrigation channels. The river was simply there, a necessary and unremarked upon component of their unchanging world. Even the earliest forms of communal gatherings, beyond the daily familial interactions, would have been deeply rooted in the practicalities of life. Perhaps a gathering for a communal meal after a particularly arduous period of labor, or a quiet assembly to discuss a shared challenge, such as an unexpected dry spell or the need for a new field. These were not raucous celebrations or lively social events, but rather sober, deliberate assemblies, focused on collective problem-solving and the reinforcement of social cohesion in the face of persistent, unexciting challenges. The conversations would be slow, the expressions muted, the overall atmosphere one of quiet determination rather than animated engagement. The constant low-level vigilance against the numerous threats to their survival, crop failure, disease, predation by wild animals. Occasional raiding from other groups instilled a pervasive sense of caution and pragmatism in the people of the basin. There was little room for recklessness or grand ambition. Every decision was weighed against its potential impact on the community's capacity to continue its monotonous existence. This cautious approach to life further contributed to the slow and hurried pace of historical development, ensuring that innovation, when it occurred, was always incremental and risk-averse. The gradual accumulation of linguistic complexity, as spoken language slowly evolved beyond its most rudimentary forms, would also have proceeded at an agonizingly slow pace. New words and phrases would emerge to describe specific tools, agricultural techniques, or environmental phenomena. But the fundamental structure and vocabulary would remain deeply rooted in the practicalities of daily life. There would be no abstract philosophical discourse, no complex poetic forms. It's just the functional exchange of information necessary for the coordination of labor and the transmission of practical knowledge. The sounds of their language, while providing a means of communication, would be delivered in the same flat, uninflected tones that characterized all other aspects of their quiet existence. The earliest forms of rudimentary measurement, focused on practical applications, would also slowly develop. A handspan, a foot length, or the amount of grain that could fill a particular pot, these would be the units of measurement. Imprecise, invariable, but functional for the immediate needs of their daily lives. There were no standardized systems, no complex mathematical principles, just the pragmatic use of easily accessible reference points for quantifying goods or distances in a consistently unexciting manner. The act of measuring was a functional chore, not an exercise in scientific precision. The subtle interplay between the agricultural cycle and the patterns of human migration, or rather the occasional internal movements of families or small groups within the basin, would also contribute to the overall slow flow of history. A family might move to a slightly more fertile patch of land, or a group might relocate closer to a new source of raw materials. These movements were not grand migrations of entire populations, but localized, pragmatic shifts, undertaken with little fanfare, and motivated by the continuous search for slightly better conditions for their unexciting, labor-intensive lives. The journey itself would be slow, arduous, and entirely without dramatic incident, following well-worn paths across familiar, unremarkable terrain. Even the development of basic artistic expression, beyond the purely functional, would remain profoundly subdued. The occasional carving of a simple pattern onto a bone tool handle, or a rudimentary depiction of an animal on a piece of pottery would be the extent of their creative output. These were not expressions of individual genius or grand aesthetic visions, but simple, repetitive embellishments born from the same patient, methodical effort that characterized all other aspects of their lives. The colors used would be earth tones, the forms basic, the overall effect one of understated, almost invisible, decoration. The concept of a ritual or ceremony, as it slowly evolved, would also be deeply practical and repetitive. Small, unadorned offerings might be made to the earth's spirits before planting, or simple prayers recited to the river before fishing. These were not elaborate theatrical performances, but quiet, consistent acts of supplication, designed to ensure the continued, unexciting success of their daily labors. The movements would be slow, the chants monotonous, the overall atmosphere one of quiet reverence rather than dramatic emotional outpouring. The purpose was pragmatic, to ensure the continuation of the mundane. The slow, gradual accumulation of material culture, the sum total of their tools, pottery, dwellings, and other man-made objects, occurred at a pace so deliberate that it would have been imperceptible to any single generation. Each new object, each minor refinement, was merely a small addition to an already vast collection of fundamentally similar items, all designed for the same basic purposes. There was no rapid turnover of goods, no constant desire for novelty, just the steady, unchanging presence of functional objects that served their purpose with a quiet, unremarked-upon efficiency. The limited nature of personal ambition in a society so focused on collective survival and repetitive labor meant that individuals generally did not strive for dramatic personal achievements or widespread recognition. Their aspirations were humble and practical: a good harvest, a healthy family, the continued availability of essential resources. There was no concept of building a personal legacy or leaving a mark on history, precisely because history itself was experienced as a slow, continuous, and fundamentally undifferentiated flow. Their lives were simply lived, their contributions primarily consisting of the diligent performance of necessary tasks. The sounds of their daily lives, as we continue to reflect upon them, would be a consistent tapestry of functional noise. The rustle of wind, the distant calls of unremarkable birds, the gentle lowing of cattle, the persistent rasp of grinding grain, the quiet murmurs of conversation, the crackle of fire, the rhythmic thud of tools against earth or wood, reinforcing the pervasive sense of monotony and repetition that defined their existence in the lower riverine basin. The earliest forms of human-animal interaction, beyond simple domestication, would also remain profoundly utilitarian. Animals were sources of food, labor, and materials. There was little concept of companion animals or the emotional bonds that characterize modern human-animal relationships. The interaction was practical, direct, and focused entirely on the animal's capacity to contribute to the human struggle for survival. Even the training of animals, if it occurred, would be simple and repetitive, focused on basic commands necessary for herding or pulling. The passage of knowledge from one generation to the next was primarily oral and experiential. Children learned by observing their elders, by participating in daily tasks, and by listening to the slow, repetitive narratives of their community's past and their shared understanding of the natural world. There were no formal schools, no written texts, no abstract lessons. Knowledge was embodied in practice, transmitted through doing and through the quiet, consistent example of daily life. This method of transmission further ensured the slow pace of change. As innovations relied on direct observation and practical emulation rather than rapid dissemination through codified instruction, the concept of wealth, in this early period, was equally unexciting and practical. It was not measured in precious metals or elaborate possessions, but in the size of a family's harvest, the number of their livestock, or the durability of their tools. Wealth was directly tied to the capacity for survival, to the ability to withstand a bad harvest or a harsh winter. It was a functional measure of resilience, not an indicator of ostentatious display or social stratification beyond the most basic distinctions based on productive capacity. The accumulation of wealth was a quiet, practical endeavor, not a source of dramatic social rivalry. The architectural uniformity of the settlements, as they slowly expanded, would reinforce the overall sense of social homogeneity. Each dwelling, while perhaps differing in very minor details of construction or size, would conform to the same basic design principles. Using the same local materials and techniques, There were no grand variations in housing styles, no architectural expressions of individual status or family distinction, just the consistent, unadorned presence of similar utilitarian shelters, blending seamlessly into the unexciting landscape. The overall visual effect was one of pervasive sameness. The daily rhythm of meals, a central component of human existence, would also remain consistently unexciting. Simple, often gruel-like preparations of ground grain and water, perhaps supplemented by dried meat or foraged edibles, would constitute the bulk of their diet. The act of eating was a quiet, functional refueling, performed with a practical efficiency rather than as a moment of culinary pleasure or social ritual. There was little variety, little spice, just the consistent provision of basic calories to sustain the endless cycle of labor. The taste, while perhaps satisfying hunger, was not designed to excite the palate. The occasional instances of minor sickness or injury within the community would be met with the same quiet stoicism and pragmatic application of rudimentary remedies. A broken bone would be splinted with sticks, a wound cleaned with water, and perhaps covered with plant matter. The recovery would be slow, uncertain, and without the dramatic interventions or swift resolutions of modern medicine. Illness was another aspect of their unexciting, challenging existence, to be endured with patient resignation. And so, we continue to immerse ourselves in the quiet drone of this early history, allowing the monotonous details to accumulate, forming a dense, unvaried tapestry of human endeavor in the lower riverine basin. The story remains one of profound and persistent repetition, a testament to the slow, deliberate unfolding of time in a world where dramatic events were rare, and every aspect of life was tied to the relentless, unexciting demands of survival. This narrative flows like the river itself, a slow, continuous current, carrying with it the unremarkable sedimentation of countless identical days.